A todos. Muito brevemente, eu gostaria de, em nome do Instituto de Economia da Unicamp, mais uma vez receber o professor Peter Evans, que conhece bastante bem o Brasil e tem vindo várias vezes à Unicamp, né? Acho que até dispensa a apresentação. Não sei se o Hugo vai fazer a apresentação, né? Mas eu gostaria só de dizer que eu, pessoalmente, estou muito feliz de ter o professor Peter Evans aqui. A gente usa os seus textos, viu, Peter? Na minha disciplina, os nossos alunos leem textos antigos, mas que são clássicos, né? Textos que são de leitura obrigatória. E também o Chico me pediu para avisar vocês, aos alunos principalmente, quem quiser, tem alguns números, alguns exemplares da revista Economia e Sociedade que estão ali fora à disposição. A hora que vocês estiverem saindo, que se quiserem, podem pegar, a distribuição é gratuita. Mas então, é só isso, nós já estamos atrasados. Eu queria só te dizer que você é muito bem-vindo e para nós é uma honra ter você mais uma vez aqui com a gente, tá certo?
Sim.
Okay. Good afternoon to you all. Just to explain, on behalf of CESIT and the Economics Institute, we'd like to thank your presence here. To hear Professor Peter Evans. Professor Peter Evans is obviously a well-known scholar and sociologist from the University of Berkeley. I don't know, the Brazilian students, as Professor Marcelo Proni said, are used to read the professor's writings, namely on the issues of development, economic development. But in this case, this session will be on trade unions and the connections between national and transnational trade unionism. Just to explain, to be very brief, initially the invitation was for Professor Peter Evans to participate in a GLU class, the Global Labor University Masters, that says it is a partner here in Campinas. So we asked Professor Peter Evans to speak in English. But obviously there was a lot more interest on his presence here, so he opened the session to everyone that obviously wanted to participate. But we have an obvious problem. It's because our GLU students, some of them don't understand Portuguese, so the idea was to maintain the session in English. Obviously Professor Evans speaks perfect Portuguese, so he'll probably mingle a little bit, but as the paper we sent to all the interested people were in English, then we'll keep the session in English. But obviously you can do whatever you want. So, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Tá bom. Então, vou falar um pouquinho em português, se bem que o meu português não é aquele perfeito que foi indicado, mas vou falar um pouquinho em português, porque eu estava com a impressão que a palestra ia ser o debate ia ser em português, então eu fiz os meus slides em português e também as minhas notas, então estou pensando um pouquinho em português, mas claro que escrevi o trabalho em inglês, então, afinal das contas, é provavelmente mais fácil explicá-lo em inglês, mas primeiro, eu queria dizer que é um grande prazer estar aqui na Campinas, que é um dos meus lugares preferidos aqui no Brasil, e também é um grande honra participar no programa da GLU, porque a GLU é eu acho, uma instituição, uma universidade muito importante no mundo, e que para mim, a GLU é aquele que é um motor da construção de uma estrutura sindical global, que eu acho a coisa que talvez seja uma das mais importantes construções sociais no mundo atual. Então, vamos fazer mais umas duas. Vamos começar com o primeiro tema. Isso não precisa ficar lá. Excelente. Esse tema, muito bom. Então, foi a minha intenção que isso seria mais uma discussão, um debate sobre a questão do movimento sindical global. Então, eu preparei umas 5 teses para discutir. Então, eu espero que vamos ter uma discussão e não queria fazer só uma palestra de 45 minutos, mas sim uma discussão, um debate. Então, claro que o debate pode ser ou em português ou em inglês, tanto faz. Então, todo mundo deve ficar à vontade em falar a língua que acha mais conveniente quando está oferecendo perguntas ou uma discussão.
Acredito que alguns alunos não estão entendendo o que você está dizendo.
Eu vou trocar para inglês agora. Okay, so I will now switch to English, and what I was just explaining is that it's a great honor to be here and to participate in the GLUE program, which I think of as one of the most important new institutions in the world and a very important construction. And I'm hoping that this will take the form of a debate, of a discussion, of back and forth, and I'm happy to have the debate take place either in Portuguese or in English. But I will speak in English, since English is the official language of GLUE. Okay, so. The paper that was distributed basically has, I would say, 3 central theses, and I sort of added 2 more for the purposes of this talk, just to expand it a little bit. But let me start with the first thesis, which is perhaps the most important of them. And the first thesis is that the neoliberal era, despite its negative consequences for national labor movements, principally in the North, but also in many places in the global South, despite the negative consequences, sometimes disastrous consequences of the neoliberal era for these labor movements at the national level, that the neoliberal era has in fact had important positive consequences for the labor movement at the global level. Okay. And I would say that these important consequences for the labor movement at the global level take 2 principal forms. First of all, I think the neoliberal era, and I'm focusing here. Do I have that on the slide? No. No. Don't change. I'm just checking on what I said. I'm talking principally now about the latter part of the neoliberal era, what we might call late neoliberalism or decadent neoliberalism, or the period basically from sort of the late 1990s to the present. But that period of the neoliberal era has seen the construction of important, or the construction or the strengthening of important organizational forms at the global level for labor, which I'm sure all the GLUE participants are very familiar with and conscious of, but which I will reiterate in any case. And it has also witnessed the the expansion of new strategies for the confrontation of labor with global corporations. And at the same time, I argue in the paper that there have been important realignments of the relationship between national labor movements and the transnational or global labor movement during this period. Perhaps the most important being an increasingly internationalist attitude on the part of the labor movement of the United States, which, despite the hard times which it has been living in for the last 40 years, remains, of course, an important actor in the global labor movement and remains an actor which commands a substantial amount of resources relative to other labor movements. Therefore, its orientation is quite important to the possibilities for the development of a global labor movement. Okay. Now, I might contrast my perspective on the development of the labor movement at the global level with the perspective offered by Beverly Silver in her classic and extremely foundational book, The Forces of Labor. Beverly Silver focuses, she has this nice little single thesis, which is where capital goes, labor struggles will follow. And I think that's a correct statement. On the other hand, I think that her focus leads us to pay attention primarily to looking at comparative labor struggles in different geographic territories around the world. And I would like to shift that focus a bit. I would like to shift that focus from comparing the position of the labor movement and the character of labor struggles in different national territories at different points in time, to instead looking at the relationships between labor movements in different territories, looking at the way in which the development of labor movements in different national territories has implications for labor movements in other national territories, and looking at the way in which the relationships among these national labor movements, together with the development of new organizational structures and strategies at the global level, reconstitutes and transforms something that we might call a global labor movement. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about these structures at the global level. Okay. At the global level, there of course have always been global union confederations and formal relationships between national labor movements in different countries and so on and so forth. But I think that it has been the case that these relationships in the past have often taken the form of a sort of a labor diplomacy, a kind of United Nations of labor where people visit each other's territories and make gestures of recognition and solidarity, but without real consequences for global campaigns, without real consequences for providing support which has significant effects at the local level. And I would argue, and this is something that I expect to get some debate on, but I would argue that this is changing. And I would argue that the global structures that exist now are both larger and stronger than previous global structures. They are, of course, not hampered by having a Cold War division down the middle. And I would argue that they have developed interesting new strategies which are still incipient in terms of their consequences, but which are potentially quite important as beginning points for a global labor movement. And just as one illustration, we can look at the evolution of the size of the principal global union federations. These global union federations, of course, if we look at them historically, these are the what used to be called significantly the international trade secretariats. And that the difference between calling them international trade secretariats and calling them global union federations is, I think, significant. And I'll get back to that in a second. But in any case, if we look at those international trade secretariats, the sectoral organization of the global trade union movement as it existed after the Second World War in what is now seen in retrospect as the golden age of capitalism. They were fragmented into tiny organizations, very sectorally specific, which might have been appropriate if you saw your primary goal as managing trade relations among different countries, etc. And they were overall very small. If we look at them now, they are huge. If we look, for example, at Industrial, the conglomeration of all the industrially oriented GUFs, and if we take the membership of all the different international trade secretariats, which formed the original origins of Industrial, together they had about 13 million members in 1950, in the post-World War II golden age of capitalism. And today, they have 52 million members, okay? Now that's a four-fold increase. If you compare that increase with what has happened to the membership of industrial trade unions, certainly in the global north, and indeed in most countries of the global south, that industrial trade union membership has been relatively stagnant over the last 50 years, which is of course not surprising since industrial employment, manufacturing employment has not grown during that period, okay? So if we just look at that number, a four-fold increase for the global trade union organization membership versus the relative stagnation of the memberships of individual national trade unions in the same sector, then we begin to say, okay, something different is going on at the global level than is going on at the national level. Now, if we move to the service sector, okay, and if we look at Public Services International, PSI, or UNI, which are the two current sort of mega confederations dealing with services, and we take all the different little international trade secretariats that out of which they eventually emerged, those organizations in the golden age of capitalism, the ones that became PSI had less than 2 million members. The ones that became UNI had less than 3 million members. Today, PSI is 20 million members, i.e. a tenfold increase, and UNI is 16 million members, i.e. about a fivefold increase. So we have a massive increase in the scale of those organizations, much more massive than the increase in the industrial unions, which makes sense since, of course, employment has been growing much more rapidly in the service sector. But the important thing is that those organizations have moved from being relatively tiny organizations to being organizations which, in combination, have a substantial proportion of the membership of all the industrial unions as well. So, point is, this is a quantitative evolution which is distinct from and diverges from the evolution of unions at the national level, and which suggests a certain dynamism and growth at the global level, which goes beyond what has happened over the last 50 years at the national level. Okay. Now, at the same time, there have emerged a variety of strategies. And these global organizations, these GUFs, were relatively passive organizations, I would argue, if you looked at them 40, 50 years ago. They were sort of the creatures of a comfortable European unionism that had a comfortable position within a sort of corporatist structure in Europe. And I don't think that that's the case anymore. I think that these organizations have become more combative, have become more willing to engage in campaigns, and they have also developed institutional strategies which have exploded over the last 20 years. If you look in the paper, there's numbers, and I didn't copy them out. But if you look at the number of global framework agreements, okay? Now, a global framework agreement, as you glue people are well aware, a global framework agreement is a normative agreement which is made usually with the global headquarters of a global corporation, but which has in theory, binding consequences for subsidiaries of that corporation wherever they may be. And the Global Framework Agreement has the virtue of, in effect, extending the sort of normative framework of locations where labor codes, etc., are stronger, extending that normative framework to other locations which lack those formal normative labor codes, and extending the willingness of corporate management in locations where corporations are used to seeing labor as a legitimate bargaining force, to locations where management may not recognize labor as a potential bargaining force at all. Now, I'm not saying that this, completely transforms the situation of contestation in other locations, but it does have the consequence of giving labor in disadvantaged territories another piece of legal normative leverage that it can use in terms of bargaining with more recalcitrant managements. Okay, and we'll go into. There's some interesting examples actually here in Brazil that I mentioned in the paper. There have also been, I think, important advances in terms of global campaigns, and I use the example in the paper of the G4S campaign, which is the security campaign which was run out of UNI and which could not have been run without that global organizational structure, but which was not the kind of activity that UNI or its preceding unions were used to engaging in the past. UNI had never been, or at least the composite federations that made up UNI had never been particularly combative, and so waging this global security guard campaign was a new kind of strategy for the global federation. So, I think it's probably fair to say that this more combative strategy came in part because of the influence of American unions in UNI, which were used to dealing with very recalcitrant, indeed, completely difficult kinds of corporate environments, and therefore we're used to waging a fiercer sort of campaign than their European competitors. Okay, so if we put together this growth of these structures and the growth of these organizations, I think we can see at the global level the basis for a more robust, a potentially more effective global labor movement. Okay? And so let me just stop there briefly and see whether somebody wouldn't like to suggest that this is, in fact, an incorrect thesis, or that I am making too much of the expansion of the GUFs, or that I am overestimating the possibility of global campaigns, or that they have another thesis to suggest as to why the transformation of the global labor movement does not have this sort of potential that I'm attributing to it. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks, Prof. My name is Mario Jacobs from South Africa. Now, just two interesting points aside from the many that I would have wanted to ask you. One is this notion of international solidarity, as you have spoken about. But the international solidarity at the level of international trade union federations is still very much ideologically defined. It is by no accident, for example, that you have the ITUC on the one hand, and you also have the WFTU on the other side. Organizations internationally established now, it used to be the ICFTU used to be the ICFTU many years ago. But yet, these international global union federations are still very much not just defined, but also ideologically operating. Then there's the area of what you label to be the increase in the membership of the ITSs. Now, the membership of the ITS is informed by the national members of the unions associated with ITS. So if a union in the public sector, for example, affiliating to the PSI, if they have an increase in membership in the PSI membership automatically increase. But there's a distinction between the numbers of the ITS in terms of membership and the consciousness of the individual member in the national country to being part of an international trade secretariat, or be the PSI, UNI, or whatever the case may be. And one must draw a distinction between that. Because yes, we can say that the membership of all these global unions have increased, but it doesn't necessarily mean to suggest that those individual members can identify with being a member of ITS and therefore need to advance the campaigns that the ITS may be pursuing in whichever country or on a global level. But also, just perhaps lastly, you make mention of current campaigns. My own experience is that there has been campaigns for the last 20 odd years. My own experience in the late 80s, for example, remembering the Corgan, where there was a global campaign of chemical unions because of poor working conditions of Corgan company so far as bashing trade union rights in South Africa. The metal union in South Africa, for example, have been on a global campaign with Volkswagen many, many years ago. Perhaps a more recent example is the handling of Israeli goods, where workers of the respective unions have refused to handle Israeli goods because of political perspective in relation to the Palestine-Israeli question. So, for me, the question of consciousness and membership is something that perhaps requires further debate on that issue. Thanks.
Okay, I mean those are excellent points, and I would agree completely that the average trade union member has no real sense of being the member of a global union federation simply because her or his union belongs to that global union federation. On the other hand, it is the first step for the unions themselves, and you can look at numbers for numbers of unions affiliated with these global union federations, and those number of union membership figures grow in the same sort of extraordinary rhythm. And indeed, if that weren't the case, you couldn't get the growth of the global union federations without a growth in the membership of individual unions and national unions. So that's the number of affiliates is key. So what I'm suggesting is that you're setting up an organizational structure, right? And organizational structures are, of course, forms that have to be filled out. They have to be filled out with action. Which is why the campaigns are important. Now, I'm not saying that global campaigns just started in the last 10 years or something, but I do think that the technology of running global campaigns has improved. I think that the ability of these organizations to run effective global campaigns has improved, and so that the global campaign has not been simply a repetitive, a repeat of the same experience over 30 years, but rather has been an evolution in which people learned how to put pressure on headquarters, learned how to mobilize people at the local level, and learned how to put those two, mobilization at the local level and pressure on headquarters, together to actually get effective results. So I think there has been an important evolution of those campaigns, even though I agree completely that they're not a novelty in the last 10 years. Let me add one other thing, and that is that in addition to the global framework agreements and the global campaigns, you've also had, I think, a further development of sort of networks of workers in the same multinational company connected to each other. Brazil has actually been very much a leader in creating these networks. They've created them primarily around foreign multinationals, BASF, and I'll talk a little more later about the Gerdau network, which is, of course, taking a Brazilian multinational and building it around that. But it is the participation in those campaigns and the participation in those networks that gives workers a sense of being part of a larger operation. Just to anticipate a little bit, in the United States, there was an important strike against BASF in Louisiana. The American steelworkers, actually, who had organized this BASF thing, asked for solidarity from Brazilian workers. Brazilian workers came up and participated in the picket line around BASF, etc. And so that kind of experience, I think, does change the consciousness of workers in terms of their sense of being part of a global movement rather than simply being part of a national trade union movement. So I mean, I think you're completely right that the organization per se does not generate a change in consciousness. On the other hand, I would say that the organization creates a structure which can then generate activities, and those activities can indeed change the consciousness of workers, give them a sense of being part of a global movement rather than being part of a rather than simply being part of a national movement. And I would argue, I mean, I'm not saying that this just sort of penetrates all workers in most places, but I think it is an increasing experience that people have that increases their sense of international solidarity. Now, with regards to the WFTU and the ITUC, it's my impression that the WFTU is pretty much a moribund organization, and that it is not, in fact, evolving in a way that engages campaigns or that builds new forms of consciousness. And I could be wrong about that, but that's my impression. And perhaps even more important, I think it's the case that the ITUC is no longer seeing itself as a combatant in an ideologically divided world so much as it's seeing itself as a combatant in a world divided between labor and capital, which I consider a very positive change. And so that I think is also a healthy evolution. We have other questions on this first. Okay, we'll move on. We can now flip the. Yes. Okay. So this is my second thesis here. And basically, this thesis is that the combination of the objective decline of the real domestic economy of the United States, as distinct from the United States as an actor in global finance, the real decline, the decline of the domestic real economy in the United States, when combined with the particularly harsh character of neoliberalism as it was imposed in the United States, basically starting in 1980 with the rise of Ronald Reagan, and perhaps the signal event in terms of getting the flavor of the harsh character with which neoliberalism was imposed in the United States in relation to labor, would be the PATCO strike. This was the strike of the air traffic controllers, who ironically had supported Ronald Reagan in the election, being elite workers, assuming that they had structural power because the kinds of skills they had were not easily replaceable. They went on strike. Ronald Reagan broke the strike and broke the union. And that was, to break that particular union was a particularly harsh attack on the American labor movement. And that kind of particularly harsh attack has, of course, continued. Not only that, that kind of harsh union-busting sort of attack, but also, of course, it has become more and more difficult to actually organize a union in the United States. The legal rules for organizing a union have become more and more difficult. The anti-labor character of American corporations is such that the technologies of preventing unionization and the number of firms which are dedicated to preventing unionization in the United States has exploded. And so consequently, trying to organize a union in the United States has become a very difficult operation, right? Okay, so my argument is that very adverse domestic context has had the consequence of managing to separate American trade unions from their old beliefs that as long as they were American unions, their livelihoods and status would be secure. The comfortable position in which unions, and I'm not saying there weren't a lot of labor struggles, but the relatively comfortable position in which unions in the United States found themselves in the golden age of capitalism in the 1950s and early 60s is now completely history. Okay? Now that comfortable position had the consequence of making American unions feel that they were part of a national project. When you combine that, and the national project perhaps best symbolized by the slogan, "What is good for General Motors is good for the United States." And that slogan was, for example, I think, effectively adopted by the United Auto Workers, in the sense that they believed that what was good for General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler was good for the United Auto Workers. And indeed, to some extent, that was true, because those auto companies in that period were willing to divide increased productivity and returns with the workers to some extent, okay? That kind of relationship spilled over into a sense of political identification at the national level, which in turn spilled over into a sense of ideological identification vis-a-vis the Cold War, which of course had disastrous consequences for the impact of the American trade union movement, particularly, I think, in Latin America, but also elsewhere in the world. And so the American trade union movement, with some justification, the AFL-CIO was labeled the AFL-CIA, and the AFL-CIO in Latin America was seen by many people as simply a tool of the American government, which indeed it was often, in truth. It was often in part because of its anti-communism, which led it to feel that when it was undermining militant unions in Latin America, it was undermining anti-democratic communist forces in Latin America, and therefore it was in fact playing a quote-unquote progressive role. Okay? So that very, to me, very sad era of the American labor movement stemmed from the combination of this comfortable position within the domestic economy of the United States and from the identification of the American labor movement with the political project of the United States, which was an anti-communist project at that time. Okay? Now, when we fast forward to the 1990s, we find the American labor movement still, many years later, hoping that it will be supported vis-a-vis the negative effects of global competition by the American state. And it is hoping, particularly, that it will be supported by the Democratic Party, to which it gives immense amounts of money and which it sees as its natural political ally. I think that the sort of wake-up call in this respect was the pushing through of NAFTA by the Bill Clinton administration. NAFTA was clearly a project of global capital, of globally oriented American capital. It was clearly a project which in no way took into account the interests of labor, either in the United States or Mexico. And so when Bill Clinton pushed that project through against the opposition of his own party, I think that was a wake-up call to the American labor movement that, whoa, we can't count on the American state to support us. Now, you may say it took a long time to wake up, but be that as it may, I think that lesson has been firmly reinforced by subsequent Democratic administrations, including the Obama administration, which is now desperately trying to get through the new Trans-Pacific Partnership, which essentially will be a much larger and in some ways more aggressive effort to further the interests of global capital at the expense of workers both in the United States and elsewhere. So, if you are American labor at the end of the 20th century, in the late neoliberal era, I would argue that you're facing a situation in which your domestic economy is going downhill from the point of view of workers. The legal and political environment is harshly neoliberal. The aggressive attacks of capital on labor are increasing all the time, and in which you cannot count on your state apparatus to protect you, either domestically or globally. Now, in this context, there is one other element, and that is, if you are an American labor union, like labor unions everywhere, you are increasingly employed by global corporations. And many of those corporations are based outside of the United States. So, on the one hand, you are confronted with a situation in which your citizenship gives you no advantage. On the other hand, you are confronted with a situation in which, in order to fight a large segment of the corporations which you have to fight, you are fighting global structures. Again, to take an example from the G4S campaign, the Service Employees International Union, somewhere there in the 90s, decided if you want to organize a security guard in the city of Chicago, you have to organize the whole damn world. Because the security guard in the city of Chicago is organized by the is employed by the G4S company, which is one of the largest employers in the world after probably Walmart. But so G4S organizes employs workers all around the world. South Africa, of course, was a big part of that campaign, India, all over the world. And so if you want to hit the G4S company, you cannot hit that company simply by attacking it in Chicago. It's like a mosquito bite if you just attack it in Chicago. If you don't attack the global structure, you are going to be unable to have any impact on the company. Okay? So the changing political and economic national environment combines with the changing structure of your employment environment, which becomes more global, and in consequence, the logic of looking for allies in the world, looking for allies outside of the United States, becomes almost inescapable. And you would have to be completely blind, I think, which is not to say that we don't have examples of trade unionists in the United States who continue to be completely blind, but it really takes some effort. And if you're a reasonably intelligent, inquisitive person and you're in the trade union movement, hard to ignore this logic which leads you to feel that transnational solidarity is crucial to your survival, right? And so consequently, you begin to get more and more examples of building transnational campaigns. The ones I look at in the paper, in addition to the G4S campaign, are the United Steelworkers, work with the Gerdau World Workers Council, the United Auto Workers under Bob King, who became very interested in trying to build solidarity with CUT in Brazil around their campaign vis-a-vis the Nissan Corporation in Mississippi. And we could, you know, I'm happy to talk about any of those campaigns in more detail if people are interested. But let me stop one more time and see whether the thesis that the American trade union movement has become significantly more internationalist in its orientation can provoke any counter thesis.
I was wondering if the paper mentions SEIU campaigns, steel workers and auto workers.
Right.
My question would be, are there any other, well, because these are well known in the literature,
Right.
namely SEIU, Justice for Janitors,
Yeah.
so a specific model of organizing. But do you see, besides these three sectors or unions, other North American unions moving in that way, let's say? Campaigning, global campaigning?
Yeah, I mean, I picked those unions because they do have these, they do have a sort of high profile, and the campaigns were, you know, sort of easy to find, easy to find examples of. But I don't think they, I mean, I'm not saying that every union is engaged in this sort of transnational campaign, but I don't think I don't think the logic is different for other unions. The UFCW, the commercial workers, has been very interested in building transnational solidarity. In fact, both the UFCW, the commercial workers, and the CWA, which is the communication workers, have been involved for several years in trying to build collaboration with the Sindicato dos Bancários, particularly here in São Paulo, trying to figure out how to organize the American financial sector. And perhaps starting with the subsidiaries of the Banco do Brasil and Bradesco and so on which they may be able to exercise a little more leverage on the basis of international solidarity. But I mean, that's a good example where in the United States, the banking sector is almost completely unorganized. I think there's like one union local and one branch of the Bank of America or something. You know, a completely unorganized sector. Which, if you compare that with the situation in Brazil, where the bancários have always had great density and been a very combative union and been one of the strong sectors in the Brazilian movement, then if you are sitting in the United States, you have to think, hey, you know, we got to figure out how we can try to transform our situation. And of course, it's also the case that the growth of global banks in the United States makes sense. Yeah. But I would underline one other thing in relation to this, which is that both the UFCW, both the UFCW and SEIU, we note that those are service sector unions, right? And when I started talking, you know, working on this project, about 15 years ago, I talked to somebody at SEIU. This must have been about 2001, 2002. And I said, well, what about, you know, transnational organizing? And he said, well, what do you mean? I mean, we organize janitors. They're not transnational. You know, they work in particular places and so on and so forth. It seemed obvious to him that in the sector where SEIU was located, and this was a guy, in fact, it was a guy who started out his career in South Africa and ended up, you know, for various reasons in the United States. But so he was not a parochial kind of guy, right? But for him, it seemed as though the logic of the sector was inexorably pointing toward, you know, this is a place-based set of jobs, etc. And over the course of, you know, the next few years, SEIU discovered, whoops, we are in a global sector. And maybe the managers of the buildings we work for are not global, but the people who own the buildings are global, and they're the people who have the power. And maybe, you know, maybe 20 years ago, the company that employed the security guard in Chicago was a local company, but that's not true anymore. It's now a global company. And so I think one of the most powerful points of impetus toward transforming the global union movement has been the fact that the service sector has become a globalized sector. That if you're working in the service sector, you are now part of a global economy, despite the fact that, you know, you're not going to, you know, your product does not go across borders, and you are not going to go across borders as a worker, or maybe not. But the sector that you're working in is now reconceived of as a global sector, and therefore we have this growth of PSI and Uni and so on as global union federations because of this transformation of the service sector, which actually comes later on in the discussion, but it is relevant to that point. But I think the other thing is that in some ways the UAW and the United Steelworkers are cases which you would not have expected to develop transnational orientations, because I don't know, maybe it didn't come here in Brazil, but 40 years ago in the 1970s, you had pictures in the newspaper of UAW workers destroying Japanese cars with sledgehammers because they were threatened by Japanese imports, okay? And so the UA, or even more recently in the 1990s, when Ron Gettelfinger was the president of the UAW, he led a cavalcade, a bunch of cars all the way from Detroit to Washington in support of the Firestone Tire Company and the Ford, I can't remember the model, which were being accused of being unsafe. And so the UAW wanted to demonstrate its solidarity with the Ford Motor Company, okay? So the UAW is a union that was in some ways very firmly embedded in this sort of nationalist orientation. And likewise, the United Steelworkers. I mean, the United Steelworkers have always been prone to seeing themselves as threatened by the global economy, by imports of steel, et cetera, et cetera. And again, you know, come the 2000s, what do the United Steelworkers realize? Well, they realize two things. One thing, they realize that it is not imports of global steel that are threatening our union right now. It is the movement of steel production in the United States from the large steel factories in the north, which were unionized, to the mini mills working on recycled steel in the south, where the virulent anti-labor character of the management is completely resistant to signing contracts with the with the United Steelworkers, whatever. So the vision of where the threat is coming from changes, And at the same time, of course, the United Steelworkers realizes that those companies in the South are in fact subsidiaries of a Brazilian company, Gerdau. So the point is that I think these examples, to me, they were interesting examples precisely because they were not necessarily the examples which you would expect, where you would expect to find a movement toward a transnational orientation. In the case of SEIU, because of the service sector; in the case of UAW and United Steelworkers, because they are sort of traditional manufacturing sectors which were traditionally easily sucked into the vision that it is the global economy that is threatening you. Right, and in both cases, I think those consciousnesses have been transformed. Okay. Any other? So everybody agrees that the United States trade union movement has become internationalist. Not yet. But do we have some specific? Just an instinct. You just have an instinct that this is.
But actually, I'm thinking of the real significance of this when it comes to actual, real, concrete consequences on the strength, relative strength of particular national labor movements, because I don't know, even if we can really prove that there is a new international orientation, especially coming from developed countries.
Well, yeah, yeah.
That comes mainly from them. Of course, there is also the other side of it, especially in Brazil. But can we really expect that international cooperation can be a force for change in a concrete way? Is it really necessary to strengthen national labor movements, or does it depend on other aspects? Of course, capital flees America and Europe and trying to avoid labor rights and environmental regulation, and starts a race to the bottom, competition worldwide, and of course it's important for developed countries.
Important qualification. First, I would say that the internationalization, or the more international orientation of American trade unions, is not primarily driven by a sense of being threatened by lower cost labor elsewhere in the world. That was the case if you looked at the United States trade union movement in the 70s or 80s. Then you might have been able to make that argument, that it is this threat from lower cost labor elsewhere in the world that is making trade unions conscious of the international arena. I don't think that's true today. And if you just look at the cases I'm talking about, they illustrate my point. It is not that the UAW is worried about. I mean, they are worried about, making cars in China. That's a problem. But that's not the primary thing they're worried about. The primary thing they're worried about is not, is labor cheaper in China? The primary thing they're worried about is, what do we do about the plant in Mississippi where Nissan refuses to recognize our union? Because that's what's going to kill the UAW. If they cannot organize plants in the United States, that's the problem. What do we do about, plants throughout the American South which are not unionized, where we don't control the workforce? It's being able to unionize the companies in the United States that's the threat to the UAW, not the question of cheaper labor abroad or what have you. Likewise, SEIU is not worried about losing security guard jobs to, security guards in India, obviously, right? I mean, their security guards are going to be employed in the United States for sure. The question is, will they be employed in the United States with union contracts, or will they be employed on the basis of precarity and a complete lack of protection, right? So it is really the driving force of this internationalist orientation is not, the threat of the race to the bottom elsewhere in the world, primarily. It is primarily the race to the bottom within the United States, which is based on trying to destroy the labor union movement and trying to turn work in the United States into a primarily precarious, informal kind of operation. Right? Okay, so that's. I think it's important to see the sort of, really, I think, quite fundamental transformation in the way in which the problems of American workers as they visualize them have shifted over the course of the last 40, 50 years. Okay, now that said, that still doesn't say what sort of positive, consequences can we expect in terms of helping workers, can this solidarity have positive effects on workers elsewhere in the world? Well, as you may remember in the paper, the argument I make is sort of varies depending on the location. I think there are some countries in which the possibility of transnational solidarity based in the United States can be fundamental in terms of changing the conditions of labor, and in those countries. And I use two examples in the paper, right? One is the CGT in Honduras, the apparel workers, in which you had a very successful transnational campaign. Now, the northern end of that campaign was based primarily on the United Students Against Sweatshops in the United States. Primarily, but you have to remember that United Students Against Sweatshops is not just a sort of student movement that came out of nowhere. In fact, United Students Against Sweatshops was the original stimulus for that, came out of the Apparel Workers Union in the United States back in the 90s. They helped get that thing started. Not that they, have anything to do with running it today, but it's important to realize it's not completely disconnected from the American trade union movement. In any case, in that case, you had workers in Honduras who had been struggling for decades, for 20 years, to organize the factory of the Russell Apparel Company, which is a U.S. company, right? And Honduras, tough environment, right? Super tough environment in which to organize. But they had kept at it, they were making progress, and they were able to leverage the fact that the market for Russell apparel goods was a market in the United States, that Russell had signed codes of conduct agreements with universities in the United States, that those codes of conduct agreements said you are supposed to obey the labor law of the countries in which you operate. Now, it turns out that Honduras has fantastic labor law. Back in the 1930s, they thought that having good labor law made you modern and progressive and so on, so they instituted quite good labor law, which is, of course, completely uma piada. In other words, it's never, it's the opposite of enforced. But Honduran labor law said, that if you're a factory there, you're supposed to recognize the union and so on and so forth. And Russell had to convince the universities in the United States that it was following Honduran labor law, unlike anybody, who was just a Honduran company, which of course you're not following the labor law, right? So anyhow, and the character of Russell's market as a university market was such that you make huge profits on university students, because though you sell them, the sweatshirt with Berkeley on the back, and you charge them double for that. And so having this university market is no small plum for a company like Russell. Okay? And so United Students Against Sweatshops managed to get Russell's contracts either canceled or threatened to be canceled in, I think it was 75 different universities. And that was a huge cost as far as Russell was concerned if it were to lose that market. And indeed, United Students Against Sweatshop was beginning to make progress in other sort of branded apparel markets. I don't know, the NBA or somebody, they were beginning to push on that market. Okay, so based on that pressure, Russell agreed to negotiate an agreement, and the agreement was negotiated in the United States, in Washington, by Russell. The CGT organizers came to Washington, sat down at the table with Russell, and the guy who was the sort of person who was working with the CGT in Washington was a fellow named Jeff Hermanson, who was a long-time, old-style apparel organizer out of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union from a long time ago. And they negotiated an agreement that was the first union agreement that Russell had ever signed. In 100 years of operating in the United States, they had never allowed a union in any of their plants in the United States. Okay? And Russell was, the union gained access to Russell's other factories. Russell overall was the largest private employer in Honduras. Okay? And so you did in that case have a major impact on a key manufacturing sector in Honduras based on this transnational network, right? Another case that I mentioned in the paper is the rubber workers in Liberia, right? Which is, again, they were trying to organize Firestone Bridgestone, which is, not completely, I mean, it's Japanese as well as American, and they were able to use solidarity both of a social movement kind, on a human rights basis, on the basis of slave-like working conditions in Liberia, and also solidarity with the United Steelworkers, which had absorbed the United Rubber Workers and therefore had contracts with Firestone Bridgestone, and we're happy to open this second front on Firestone Bridgestone, whom they were fighting with in the United States anyway. And those workers, I think it was 5,000 workers at the plantation, the rubber plantation in Liberia, got a union contract, and that was, that's a big deal, because Liberia is not a huge economy, and that export of rubber is a key sector. And so in small countries which have particular relationships with the transnational economy, this kind of transnational solidarity, I think, can make a big difference. Now, obviously, bigger countries, bigger economies, it's harder to see where transnational solidarity is going to transform the economy. But anyhow, I've got another. Oh, let me just say one other thing on this question, and that is, one of the problems for my analysis is that I have a harder time finding good examples of European unions who are making the same kind of transition. Now, what?
Why is that?
That's what I would like somebody to explain to me. But but it is the case that it's much harder to find a sort of more aggressively internationalist or a transformation toward more internationalism on the part of the European Unions. Now, in part, of course, the European Union's never had the same kind of terrible, anti-internationalism the U.S. unions had. So, I mean, the IG Metall and so on and so forth always had better kinds of transnational relations, and I mean, I think they were important to the metallurgicos here in Brazil, that solidarity during the dictatorship and so on. So European unions were better to begin with, but I haven't seen the same kind of evolution, at least not yet. We'll see how another 10 years of austerity changes their attitudes. But so anyhow, that's a problem in terms of my thinking around this. It's one of the problems. We might get to other problems later. Yeah, you had another question.
Was Karl Marx who said that the American working class is a special breed of workers?
Try that again.
Was Karl Marx who said that the American working class is a special breed of workers?
Is especially?
Special breed.
Yeah, okay.
For the reasons advanced by my two speakers, I accept that the context of your paper deals with almost the internationalization of trade union movements, international solidarity, international campaigns, and the like. But surely there is a national component to that too. And the national component in my reasoning now is to say that there's no evidence suggesting that the American trade union movement is growing in membership. In fact, the converse is being proven.
Absolutely.
And that is obviously an area of concern which may just tie into the question of whether they are not purely seeking to protect the base of their own constituency of membership. I'm not arguing the advancement of labor and stock issue or anything of the sort, but at some point you are pushed against the wall and you say, unless I now start fighting back, nothing will exist of me. Because the other example, as you correctly made, yes, there are those indicators in some sectors of the American economy where those international campaigns are being fought. But in the finance sector, for example, there's no trade union resistance. A colleague of ours recently defended his master's thesis on exactly that question. And the question must be posed, why is it that America, the institution with the finance capital, or controlling the finance capital of the world, there's no institutional trade union movement in the finance sector. So those are important questions because surely an American trade union or American trade union organizing in the finance sector would be critical for international finance and surely international finance campaigns that could be pursued at the global level.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying. In other words, that I think you're agreeing with me in the sense that we both agree that it is the extremely negative situation of the American trade union movement that is the starting point for this international orientation. Now, why the American trade union movement is as weak as it is, and why it is particularly weak in the finance sector, would go beyond my particular venue here. I would, however, question the hypothesis that organizing the financial sector would have the potential of having an impact on the global politics of finance. Because even if you organized every bank worker in the United States, the banks would not feel threatened in terms of their, the way in which they move money globally. because they don't need many people to do that, and the people that do that are extremely well paid and will never be unionized. I mean, you know, they're and so organizing the rank and file bancario in the United States is not an avenue for changing global finance policy. I think that change global finance policy, you really need a different avenue of attack, which, you know, has much more to do with you know, political power, not just at the national level, but vis-a-vis global organizations, et cetera. Again, that's a whole other story. But I mean, I think that the role of the bancarios here in Brazil is a good example. I mean, the bancarios, very well organized, very competitive, have managed to extract a bit of the huge surplus that the banks make for themselves as bancarios. But I don't think it's the bancarios that are combating the extraction of financial resources here in Brazil. I think that's a fight that has to be waged at the level of political party policy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think there's a disconnect between financial policy and global financial policy and the bank as a point of service production, because, you know, the fact is that banks don't really care that much about whether deposits get deposited or whether you know, loans get made to individual homeowners or things like that. In fact, I think in some ways banks would, if they can, would just as soon get rid of all that sort of contact with ordinary people. But that's really a different thing. Okay. I think I better get on to 3, which is Brazil, because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. And I probably am going to run out of time before I get to my last 2 theses, but that's fine, because those were sort of added on in any case. Okay. So the third thesis is that emerging countries generate emerging trade union movements, which in turn provide potentially key partners in the construction of global trade union internationalism. And I think that this is a change from 30, 40 years ago, that the importance of emerging countries in the global economy has created a possibility for a transnational labor solidarity, the construction of a transnational labor movement that did not exist when those countries were more marginal to the global economy or were less firmly integrated in the global economy. Okay? And I would argue that Brazil exemplifies this potential. Brazil is one of the countries in the world where trade union density has been increasing. It's a country where the trade union movement is relatively politically powerful. It is a country which increasingly is a home for global capital. And therefore, Brazil becomes an interesting strategic partner for trade unions elsewhere in the world. And I developed this point particularly in relation to these American campaigns, the Gerdau campaign and the UAW campaign, where the role of Brazilian trade unions in terms of making those campaigns possible was critical. And I mean, in the case of the Gerdau campaign, the United Steelworkers would not have been able to win that contract in the American South without solidarity from Brazil. So, the potential global role of the Brazilian trade union movement, therefore, depends on a combination of the fact that Brazil is now integrated into global capitalism in such a way as it is the home for certain global corporations, and it depends on the relative political strength of the trade union movement within Brazil. And this well, let me say one other thing, and that is that it is also the case that Brazil has done the Brazilian trade union movement has done a good job of making use of the global instruments that exist. One small example involved the metallurgicus who were trying to organize a parts supplier that supplied parts to Mercedes-Benz, okay? And so the metallurgicus, Mercedes-Benz was pretty well organized, et cetera, but the parts supplier was resisting unionization. And so the metallurgicus in Brazil were able to take the global framework agreement that Mercedes-Benz had signed, and they were able to say to Mercedes-Benz, look, this parts supplier is not abiding by your global framework agreement, and therefore this parts supplier is in violation of your global framework agreement, and we will strike against you unless you enforce your global framework agreement on this parts supplier. And from Mercedes' point of view, why should they protect this parts supplier particularly? And so therefore, Mercedes was indeed willing to put pressure on the parts supplier, and the metallurgicus were able to get in there and get organized. So you're taking a global instrument, the global framework agreement, and you're using it to extend unionization and union power within the country by using this leverage that you've gained vis-a-vis the multinational corporation, right? Brazil has also used the idea of networks, multinational networks, principally vis-a-vis European companies, to build union solidarity among the different unions operating in the same company, which of course can be very fragmented within Brazil, right? You can have many different unions organized in the company. So they've been able to use the structure of the multinational company to actually generate alliances and solidarities within Brazil. And again, as in the Mercedes case, they've been able to use pressure on the multinational company, particularly the European multinational company, to make progress against various suppliers and other people who are part of the overall productive chain of these companies, but who are in no way abiding by the global framework agreements that these companies have signed. So the point is that Brazil has not just been a participant in transnational campaigns, but has been able to figure out ways to leverage these global instruments to do organizing at the national level, right? Okay, so here we come to an interesting point, which is the question of why do we have to use Brazil as an example? Why is it not the case that we can use Korea? I'm sorry, I've lost my South African participant here for this, but maybe he'll come back in time to, I can repeat it slightly. Why is it that we're not using more cases from Korea, cases from South Africa, etc.? And we won't even talk about China because then we would run out of time completely, but although we could if we don't run out of time. In any case, if we were to look at the national territories in which the labor movement seemed most promising in the beginning of the 80s, or even maybe certainly in the case of South Africa in the beginning of the 90s, South Africa and Korea would have been countries which seemed very promising. They seemed to have this quote-unquote social movement unionism. They seemed to have union movements that were on the verge of becoming politically powerful within the country. And indeed, they had union movements that had huge political impact in both countries. The trade union movement in South Korea was very important in terms of the struggles for democratization, and obviously Kosatu was fundamental to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Okay. Now, if we look at both of those trade union movements today, obviously they're still among the stronger trade union movements in the world, in the global South. They're still very militant, etc. But they do not have the kind of political strength internally that gives them the possibility of playing the sort of global role that the Brazilian trade union movement is currently capable of playing. Arrived back just in time. I was just raising the question of why it was the case that Korea and South Africa, which seemed to be among the most promising trade union movements in the world in the 80s in the case of Korea, in the 80s and 90s in the case of South Africa, no longer appeared to have the kind of political strength that gives the Brazilian trade union right now the possibility of being a strategic ally for important transnational solidarity campaigns. And I would argue that if we look at these three trade union movements, Brazil, South Africa, and Korea, in all three cases, those trade union movements gained political power and strength because they were in the vanguard of broad democratization struggles. Here in Brazil, obviously, the trade union movement absolutely fundamental to the fight against the military regime. As I was just saying, that is also true in Korea and South Africa. And so, in the case of Brazil, the Brazilian trade union movement is fortunate to have somehow preserved that political strength that was basically generated by being part of a very broad democratic project, a very broad alliance which included a number of groups in terms of civil society. Okay. Now, I would argue that in Korea and South Africa, for very different reasons, in both cases, the trade union movement somehow became separated from this broader kind of civil society project. And so when I look at these three countries, the lesson that I take from them is that trade union movements are incredibly important for broad political projects of democratization. But for them to maintain their political strength, somehow they have to be able to maintain connections with a broader kind of a civil society movement. And if they are unable to do that, they will no longer be able to sustain the kind of political power that enables them to play this strategic role, which is there potentially on the basis of the economic position of their countries in the world economy, right? And so for me, that's a very important caveat in terms of my general thesis that the trade union movements in emerging countries have this potential to be important reinforcements to the overall growth of the global trade union movement. And maybe I should just open that up and see whether people have any interesting commentaries on either the Brazilian trade union movement or the more general hypothesis that trade union movements in major countries in the global south are likely to become more important strategic actors in a global trade union movement. What?
We prefer to listen to you.
Ah, but see, my whole project here was to get some.
Then you have to come back.
You might know in terms of South Africa, but I think that much of what I see in Brazil is what happened in South Africa. So you see an institutionalization of the trade union movement almost becoming part of the state. In Brazil, the case of Kuti and Pete.
Yes.
The South African case of Kusatu and ANC. So I don't think there's a difference between South Africa, I can't speak for Korea, but I don't think there's a difference between South Africa and Brazil in that sense. So the struggles that they are advancing are not struggles that are advancing on the shop floor or in the community. They seek to convince the government of the day, the Brazil, FTA, and South Africa, ANC, to bring about social reform by parliamentary means. So when Kuti demands an increase in the minimum wage, they don't do so as a result of the bargaining power of the unions or its members. They give the demands to Pepe and they seek Pepe to introduce an increase in the minimum wage. As in South Africa, we've seen the same. So the development that has been the case in South Africa in the very last talk become the case in Brazil, if not already now.
Okay, that's a good argument. I would say that obviously you're correct that the trade union movement in Brazil right now has a comfortable relationship with the government and therefore is looking for campaigns that will enable it to use that comfortable relationship vis-a-vis the government. On the other hand, I would also argue that the trade union movement in Brazil, and this hopefully we'll get some discussion of this, that the trade union movement in Brazil still has sufficient density and shop floor power such that it is exercising power in society in addition to exercising power vis-a-vis the government. And that, of course, does not mean that it will always be the case, right? Because obviously, the more you depend upon simply exercising power through the government, the more you are vulnerable to the possibility that your relationship with whoever is in charge of the government deteriorates, and then you're left with no power, right? And then it becomes a question of, can you rebuild the power that you had on the basis of shop floor struggles and so on. So I would say that the future evolution of the Brazilian case in this respect is certainly not to be taken for granted one way or another. Now, let's move just briefly to the question of South Africa, which I would say that the position of the trade union movement in South Africa is far worse than the position of the trade union movement in Brazil. And partly, I would argue, this is because the Brazilian economy is a very different economy than the economy of South Africa. And the economy of South Africa is an economy in which the deterioration of conditions of work in the service sector has been intense, in which an economy in which manufacturing is not basically going to survive as a major source of employment, and therefore unions whose base in manufacturing are very vulnerable. And also, I would argue that there's a huge difference between Brazil and South Africa in that in Brazil, the PT has no electoral monopoly. So the PT cannot treat the trade union movement as basically you can support us or not, but we're going to win the election anyway, and so we would prefer to have you on board, but if you're not on board, we know we're going to win anyway. The PT does not know it's going to win with or without the trade union movement, but in any case. And so I would argue that the ANC's monopoly on electoral power has meant that the trade union movement does not have the same possibilities for exercising power vis-a-vis the government. I mean, I think there are other features of the South African economy which are also quite distinctive. Principally, the inability of the domestic economy to extract its share of the incredible profits that are being gained out of the export of natural resources from South Africa. But so I mean, I think that South Africa is for me a very worrisome case, and especially the current splits between NUMSA and other forces in COSATU, between the Communist Party and COSATU and NUMSA, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think it is a case in which the potential strategic global importance of that trade union movement has been compromised by the evolution of domestic politics, which in turn is not unrelated to the domestic character of the economy, but it's really a political question, I think. I don't know. You're okay. Rui will now. Yeah, we're going to run out of time, but that's fine. I'm not. I mean, we need to quit when? Yeah. So I have these two other theses, but they're really subsidiary. So as long as I get through with these three, I'm quite happy. Yeah. But I'm still interested in the extent to which people see the potential strategic value of trade union movements in the, quote, emerging countries of the global South as a thesis that can be defended, or whether you think not so much. Yes. Tá. Ah, tá bom.
Eu acho que as três teses são muito interessantes, mas como as duas intervenções que foram feitas aqui pelos colegas já apontaram para isso, elas enfatizam muito o aspecto organizacional e deixam de lado o conteúdo das negociações e das mobilizações. Então, a minha pergunta é, quando você fala em força ou possibilidade de enfrentar o neoliberalismo, o movimento sindical em escala internacional enfrentar o neoliberalismo, ou do sindicalismo de países emergentes como o Brasil, e se contrapor, e de adquirir uma força global, a minha pergunta é em que medida essa possibilidade ela repercute em termos de conquistas efetivas, em termos de capacidade de intervenção na agenda de negociação e de obtenção de resultados. Quer dizer, em que medida esses resultados sinalizam efetivamente para uma agenda anti-neoliberal, que seja capaz de enfrentar o neoliberalismo. Eu não vejo muito isso em escala global, não sei em aspectos muito complexos. Então, eu queria que você desenvolvesse mais essa questão do conteúdo, do resultado concreto das mobilizações e das negociações.
Sim. Eu faço uma separação entre a luta trabalhador-capital e uma luta em termos mais global contra o neoliberalismo, né? E eu acho que o primeiro passo para o movimento sindical é de fortalecer a sua capacidade de lutar contra o capital, né? Então, Por quê? Porque lutando contra o capital, fortalecendo os direitos e o seu poder em relação das empresas, você cria uma base de poder que aí pode entrar na questão da política mais geral, né? Então, claro que também tem essa questão de se forçar em termos da política, né? E claro que como disse o companheiro da África do Sul, esses sindicatos também se esforçam em relação dos partidos políticos, ou pelo menos tentam, e das políticas, né? Mas eu acho que conceber o neoliberalismo como se fosse uma entidade em si, não seja muito útil em termos da luta política. Eu acho que os ganhos mais concretos ao nível de você tem poder através da companhia, da empresa, você tem poder através do partido político, que também depende do seu poder ao nível de luta contra a companhia, é fundamental para qualquer mudança ao nível mais global em relação ao neoliberalismo. Eu acho que o poder do neoliberalismo se funda no primeiro passo no poder das empresas e na falta do poder dos trabalhadores em relação das empresas. E claro que tem questões de políticas globais, etc., mas eu não acho que focalizando o neoliberalismo é tão útil em termos de entender o papel do movimento sindical. Eu acho que o movimento sindical faz parte de um contexto geral contra várias políticas que se chamam de neoliberal, né? Mas que o neoliberalismo não é uma coisa em si, é uma coletânea de poder, as partes mais importantes sendo o poder de capital. Dito isso, eu acho que outro problema é o problema do capital financeiro e a questão de como você enfrenta o problema o poder do capital financeiro, que realmente está, como eu disse antes, também é um pouquinho remota das lutas do dia a dia, né? E você tem que atacar o poder do capital financeiro através de uma estratégia realmente internacional que precisa ter poder em relação de governos nacionais, que implica poder em relação dos partidos nacionais, mas também tem isso eu acho um problema realmente de um outro nível de complexidade, como enfrentar o poder do capital financeiro global, que eu diria é o cerne do chamado neoliberalismo, em termos de criar política de fazer que os governos nacionais são constrangidos, etc. Então, eu acho isso outro papo, mas eu acho que se o movimento sindical consegue enfrentar o poder da empresa e daí construir o seu próprio poder, e aí tem poder em relação dos partidos políticos, essa é fundamental para qualquer progresso na direção de um quadro geral que seria alguma coisa bem diferente do que o neoliberalismo, né? Se bem, eu acho que neoliberalismo talvez seja um conceito que já era efetivamente. Quer dizer, a parte ideológica do neoliberalismo já se esgotou. Então, o que fica é o poder, principalmente do capital financeiro, e a capacidade do capital financeiro utiliza os governos nacionais como instrumentos da agenda dele, né? Então, não sei se eu respondi.
Eu acho que a gente estabelece uma relação ou pensa o capital e o neoliberalismo de maneira diferente. Mas eu não vou discutir isso, eu quero só tocar nesse ponto relativo ao neoliberalismo, ao esgotamento do neoliberalismo. No que se refere à questão das negociações sindicais efetivas, a capacidade de mobilização do sindicalismo. Uma das principais bandeiras do neoliberalismo, que é o trabalho flexível, o trabalho
Sim.
de direitos do trabalho, não é algo que sobrevive apenas no plano ideológico.
Claro.
Sobrevive no plano da política e da negociação,
Exatamente.
inclusive pela parte do movimento sindical. Então, quando você diz, olha, o sindicalismo está enfrentando o capital, eu me pergunto, será que está mesmo?
Porque não está enfrentando, na sua opinião, não está enfrentando essas políticas, isso?
Não de maneira
Efetiva.
em alguns casos, fazendo parceria com o capital, negociando para minimizar o efeito dessas políticas, mas não para substituir. Então, é essa questão que eu
Não, aí a gente está no mesmo. Eu concordo que esse realmente é um problema, né? Mas ainda assim, eu acho que a capacidade do sindicato de ganhar algum poder de barganha ao nível da empresa é importante para fazer uma fundação para a luta em termos da política. E, na medida em que o movimento sindical é muito fraco em relação das empresas, então é muito difícil enfrentar a política, né? Mas eu diria que o Brasil, pelo menos, é um dos países em que, em certos aspectos, pelo menos, a informalidade está sendo um pouquinho, vamos dizer, derrotado no sentido de que tem mais pessoas com carteira assinada, tem mais empregos formais nesse sentido de carteira assinado. Tem uma parcela crescente de salário no PIB nacional, que é muito diferente do que outros países. E também tem um aumento real no salário mínimo. O salário mínimo chegou a alcançar o nível de 1940, mais uma vez, que é uma grande vitória relativamente, que não houve nos Estados Unidos, onde nós não conseguimos recuperar o nível de 1960 e tal. Então, eu acho que no Brasil, você está fazendo algum progresso em relação do neoliberalismo, no sentido de a política em relação do mercado de trabalho, das relações de trabalho. Talvez não seja a grande transformação que a gente queria, mas pelo menos nos últimos 10 anos estava numa direção melhor do que era. Você não concorda? Ah, sim.
Porque assim, a minha questão não diz respeito especificamente ao Brasil, né? Então, tem duas dimensões. A dimensão global, o desenvolvimento da escala global, e da condição específica do Brasil.
É. Ao nível global, eu concordo. Quer dizer que os Estados Unidos e a Europa são muito... a trajetória não é muito otimista, não. Então, nesse... isso outro papo. Então temos que voltar para inglês. I don't know how many people were following that discussion, but it was a discussion as to whether the kinds of strategies I was talking about are effective or sufficient to change the kinds of politics that shape the rules that determine people's experience in the labor market. In other words, the movement toward greater precariousness of jobs of different kinds, which is in part at least a question of legal and political policy, although it's, it also has an element which is independent of that. But whether the labor movement has been able to make progress in relation to changing those rules having moved in a very negative and adverse direction in the last 40 years. And my response is that that actually, I think in the last 15 years, there has been some reversal of that prior deterioration here in Brazil, and unfortunately, we can't say the same thing for most other countries in the world, which is why I feel that trying to figure out how to build a more powerful transnational labor movement that can provide support for national labor movements in other places is fundamental. Okay, I think probably we should. Yeah, we should. Yeah, we'll forget the other two theses we can do on another time. Yeah. No, they're. Okay, thank you all.
It was a very thought-provoking conference. Didn't have many questions, but hopefully we'll be back here.
Great. Yes, you can work on your counter theses.
A little bit on